Awesome. So, welcome everyone. This is the 18th of January, 2023, and this is the orchestration demo. Just before you jumped in, Vlad and I were just chatting, so I just jumped back to that conversation, which was like, yeah, so release environments. What were your thoughts, Vladimir?
I think that's really great idea. And we really need to test like different versions and test, like different setup for customers and upgrades and etc. etc. But I have a little, like, don't get me wrong, I'm not against that. I'm just trying to brainstorm the whole idea. I feel like that might be kind of universal way to create environments, installations, not environments, because we discussed with Graham that environments is very confusing name. So like installations is better. Like, I feel like there might be some kind of universal way to do those installations. Because now we're creating like a two separate path, right? So like the path for creating those installations and testing those installations, then path to testing deployments, then path to testing clusters, and etc. etc. I feel like there might be the option to wrap everything around and kind of make the universal solution. But I may be wrong. I don't know.
So I think what you're like, I do see what you're saying. So I guess it's kind of a bit tricky here in a way. If we're talking about let's talk about like GitLab installations themselves. It's actually kind of interesting, and this has only happened within the last 6 months or so, in that we kind of now actually have kind of some pretty good tooling and some pretty good communal tooling around spinning up GitLab installations that's repeatable, and kind of everyone focuses on the one tooling, and that's called GET, the GitLab Environment Toolkit. And that's what the GitLab dedicated team is using. That's what Claudia used, and that's what other people kind of use. The release environments work. What I've done so far is, like, obviously the bare bones, it's the bare minimum. It spins up some small, like basically some containers in a namespace via the Helm chart to do an installation. Ideally, what we'd like to do in the future is actually be able to support other deployment mechanisms. The GitLab operator probably being the next easiest one, and then maybe even get installations as well. The tricky part there as well, and I guess when you say deploys, you're probably talking about GitLab.com in that case. The tricky part there is it is different to everything else we do, and it is unique because it kind of, and that grew up organically. The architecture is unique. The deployments or the deployment mechanism is unique. It's not as, unfortunately, and we could probably do, I mean, the team should, well, whether the team should do the work in the future is debatable, but it is different. And so while I think what I would like to do, I think one thing we definitely can do is, or what I was hoping with at least some of the release environments work, is there's parts of GitLab.com that we can't really change or control at the moment now with the kind of new realignment of teams. And that's basically around the cluster level and the infrastructure level that's owned by foundations now and what have you. What we do have ownership of is obviously the GitLab.com repository and the actual deployment of GitLab into the Kubernetes cluster, and also Gitly nodes. We can't forget them. What I was hoping is, not straight away, but I think in a few months, depending on how the release environments work goes and what we end up doing with that and how we kind of find that and work that out, I think a lot of what we do there should actually go into GitLab.com or almost replace the GitLab.com. So what I'm saying is, we would still have, like, auto deploy and everything is the same, but the actual K8s workloads GitLab.com, what that pipeline currently looks like, should probably almost be the same as the pipeline for the release environment stuff. Like, they should actually be the same. Like, there'll be two separate Git repositories, but arguably they will be doing the same thing. They will work the same way. They will be the same way. And
that's what I meant.
Yeah. And so what we want to hope there is like, even though release environments at the moment is like one of the big things I'm doing with the release environment stuff is trying to avoid hard coding things, trying to make it a bit more dynamic and things like that to enable that. Because that's one of the big problems we have the GitLab com repo. If you wanted to add like a new cluster, if you wanted to add a new anything at the moment, the GitLab com stuff, it's actually very difficult. You actually got to modify a whole bunch of stuff in like our common repo. There's a whole bunch of stuff, which is a whole lot of technical debt we have, which we've just never addressed and what have you. And we should address, and we've got many issues and epics open to address that. But the release environments work is kind of an opportunity to say, well, this is a totally separate thing. Can we build something which is essentially doing the same thing? It's deploying GitLab.com inside a Kubernetes namespace in some cluster somewhere. But actually kind of doing it from the ground up. And, you know, it turns out what we actually need to do is pretty simplistic. A lot of the tricky parts to it is once again, it's that installation management. It's how do we call these environments? And if we add an environment, what's the overhead, especially for things like release tools, which is going to be running in the stable branches to actually kind of like it's not going to just be a pipeline trigger. I think release tools is going to have to do some more stuff there, but nothing too crazy. But it's definitely going to have to use like the file API, the commit API, I think, to actually populate some files and actually, you know, set it off that way. So we're building all this stuff. So I think overall we're kind of going in that direction for GitLab com and the release environment stuff. And the other thing that should give us, hopefully, with building stuff a bit more dynamic and stuff, is that we can, like, if we need to spin up an experiment, like the Rails 3 stuff, for example, becomes much easier. If we need to spin up a test environment, like a test, if we want to test something else new, it becomes a lot easier. If we want to start doing review sites, we can probably do that a lot easier because none of our stuff is actually hard coded. It's just a case of like, you know, it becomes a lot easier to do that kind of stuff because it is all dynamic and it all revolves around some, you know, we're defining actual, whereas at the moment the GitLab com repo has no real solid interface to it, which I know sounds weird. You know, by the release environments work, we've been doing stuff like, you know, defining an environment schema. And we've been validating that schema. So you actually give a file that represents an environment. And currently it's just the pipeline with Helm that actually, you know, is the, I guess, the orchestrator that actually creates that environment, that does the work, but it can be anything. It's irrelevant. The point is we're splitting off the interface of us defining what we want to deploy versus the actual implementation of that. We're not going to see the benefits of that straight away, probably not for a while, but I think that's something that's also very important. If we have this kind of unified model that we can say, this is what I want to do, and then we're able to, people who actually do the deployments and implement that, whether it's us, whether it's another team or whatever, we can still define the interface. We will give you this file, this model that defines what we want deployed and where, and then we expect that to happen and you give us that result. So I do think we will slowly try and unify that. I think 100% we want to unify at least the release environments, the GitLab com stuff. Now, if reliability is talking about using more parts of Get, the GitLab environment toolkit altogether, so that's joining like the kind of unique parts we have of GitLab.com, but bringing that back to the standard tooling that that's part of Get, then we would probably align with that as well, and we'd all kind of like align around that in some way, I assume. So I think there's even further opportunities there. I don't know the status of that yet. That's really up to what reliability want to do. But I do think, you know, you're right, and it's worth pointing out as well. I mean, there's more than just the couple of ways we've described here of deploying GitLab within GitLab. There's GDK, there's GCK, there's you know, Quality have got their own mechanism. I think the goal is for Get to try and be kind of the unified way of doing that underneath. So as I said, I do want release environments to support that, even if it's just becomes like a, you know, the model on top and underneath it's actually running Get. That seems fine to me. It's probably something we'll do for testing omnibus installations. But that's how I kind of see it, is I think we should continue to work on GitLab com to get it more usable while we can. But hopefully as we kind of actually get release environments working and up and running, we can start to see what works and doesn't work out of that. And then hopefully, you know, that can cross-pollinate, and eventually somehow I think we would kind of make it one repo somewhere, and we'd actually just kind of like pull from like just the code that's making this, or whatever it is that makes the actual implementation happen, be something that's shared and just pulled into each of those two places.
That's
Great.
very interesting. I never heard about this get, and I also haven't looked at the GitLab operators. I should probably take a look and see what they can do.
So get is quite, as I said, it's pretty important now. Sales teams use it a lot with customers, my understanding is, and stuff. So it's pretty like, you know, it's got some level of like not only maturity but also like mind share within the company. The GitLab operator was done as a joint effort with Red Hat, because they're massive into the operator space after they acquired CoreOS. I like operators as well. I think it's a great installation mechanism and idea. It just hasn't taken off yet because I just don't think the industry not as many people as are into operators yet. I think we will see adoption grow for it. Well, I think what we need to do. I think what the company needs to do first is they have to take that out of beta. I think they still got the operator in beta or something. But I think once that happens, and that's one of those, we in delivery should be aware of this, because this is one of those other things they might just spring on us 1 month to decide it's out of beta, and then all of a sudden they ask us questions about are we releasing this? Are we supporting this? Are we tagging this? And what have you? So I think the release environments project, what I want to be is kind of like a layer on top of those installation mechanisms, and just be like, I define what the environment I want. We have some way of implementing that. And then, you know, in your model, you say, I want an environment running these versions, but I would like it to be installed via Get, or I would like it to be installed via just Helm in a namespace, or I would like it to be installed by the GitLab operator. And then, you know, we have different kind of pieces that actually do the work and implement that.
So one question, are you thinking about implementing some sort of environment definition file that you're like in YAML format or whatever, and you check in the Git repository?
So we already have one. It's very simple because we haven't got much, but we already have one already in there. And we validate it with JSON schema. So we define a schema that it has to, all the files have to meet, and any file you try and put in gets validated and rejected if it doesn't meet the schema. It's worth noting for those, sorry, I'm just going to segue one little bit more. So there's talk about resurrecting the service catalog as well. We used to have a service catalog. We even used to have a web app. I can't remember the person who was working on it. They left a few years ago, shortly after I joined, actually. And that just got pushed by the wayside, like not really used much. They actually want to bring that back. And they're going to be using JSON schema. Once again, they're going to be defining a model for the service, like a service and a service catalog. They've got a schema that they want it to adhere to. They're going to validate that. I've been chatting on the issue about how we're going to kind of make that a bit more discoverable and some other improvements we can do. So I think that the environment model, or maybe it's not an environment model, it's an installation model, that whatever we decide will tie into that, I think. And then also there's a metrics catalog, which they're starting to define a schema for as well. So we're going to have all of these schemas and models. And I would like to, whatever we end up doing for release environments, I'd like to propose, hey, we've got a model for like an installation, or, you know, of GitLab. Maybe we can, you know, contribute that to that as well. And I think one thing we also see is a model for clusters. Like we need some unified model of what is the infrastructure, right, that we can deploy to.
One thing
Can I just jump in a little bit, so we don't lose all the time just sort of
sure.
Could we actually get like a practical kind of like where are we with release environments right now?
Yeah, sure.
What I want to make sure we kind of are thinking about is what like from the kind of epic status and due date we currently have, like I think we should probably adjust those, decide what makes sense in terms of like, is there a first iteration, and then how does that actually line up for next quarter? Like, you know, where do we want to take this? Are there pieces that run in parallel? So it'd be good to kind of get an idea of where we're up to and where we're going next.
Yep. So I'll quickly share. So so we're very close to actually having something running. If I can find the right. Here we go. So This, so I attempted to actually deploy an environment for the first time yesterday. It didn't work. I have this MR open that either I think Vladimir or Skarbek can review and approve. And once that's merged, we should, in theory, hopefully, actually have a running environment we can actually see, and hopefully, if it doesn't break. This is still but a small piece in the whole picture. This is actually showing, okay, I can define an environment and it actually works. So if we look at, so we have this environment 15.6 stable, which is just this is what I'm just using to say, hey, can you try and test this to build this environment? This is the versions we want to run. This is the cluster we want to install it to. At the moment, we only have one cluster for this particular supported mechanism. Likewise, we have an install type of Helm, but that's the only thing we support at the moment. So this is the environment that I'm trying to get up and running. The CI/CD failed on it. The installation process failed on it last time because, interestingly, something I didn't know about, the GitLab Helm chart tries to do an upgrade check. It tries to make sure you're following the supported upgrade path, but it completely has no, it doesn't work for us because we run RCs, we're going to run SHA tagged things like we're just not going to be running tagged known like releases. So I think it falls over when you're not just, following the standard kind of Semver image tags that you're passing in, right? Like the version of GitLab you're running is not just, it's not like 15.6.1. It might be, some other random version. So that's why I'm basically turning this off. So I'm going to turn all the upgrade checks off in this environment, and then hopefully we'll actually have a working environment. So if I bring up the Epic now, should be mostly up to date, but I will double check it is. So that would mean this kind of task here, make it a bit bigger. This kind of task here will be done. So basically, once we can get here and we're like, yes, we can deploy an environment, we can make that environment work. This will mostly be done. So this is all the like infrastructure and getting something to work part. Then we actually need to deploy stable branches to the last 3 minor releases. Then we need to look at test suites. Then we need to start look at, well, have we actually got CNG images being built from stable branches? And then we have to actually start figuring out how release tools is going to interface into this, right? Which is probably finding the environment file in the Git repo, updating the values, and actually doing a new commit or a merge request or something with that, and actually doing it the kind of GitOps way.
Hopefully this is not necessary, especially if we want to go commit by commit. This is something I was trying to figure out. So at least for CNG, it looks like it's entirely possible to just downstream, trigger in this case, because it's another environment, to trigger a pipeline that will produce
artifacts.
Artifacts, and you can even provide the expected image name that you want out of it. So basically you can feed in all the variables file. Instead of committing the variable files, you can just feed in values. And you can also feed in the expected name that it has to produce for you.
Produce back. Perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really good to hear. So that part, which I wasn't worried about, but I was not sure how difficult it would be, should be relatively straightforward then. So interestingly, things like that could probably be done in parallel. So what I mean by that is we could probably have stable branches starting to trigger into distribution already, even if we're not deploying them to release environments yet, right? Like someone could actually sit down and be like, right now I'm going to add the job. So in all stable branch commits, we're going to actually go to distribution and build images. Like we don't have to do these all in like step order, right? The only part we probably need to do that before the other is we need to have release tools kind of the interface with release tools and how it's going to interface with the release environments repository kind of defined, but and worked out. But once that's kind of done, most of these other tasks can hopefully fall into place. We have a lot of tasks that are just like making release release environments repo better. Like let's add renovate, let's use deployment tracking in GitLab. We need to tweak permissions. We need to do a security review. I just realized if I deploy this environment now, it's going to have the default GitLab password, and like I need to make sure it's going to just put this new GitLab installation straight out on the internet. So we need to have a task where we're like, how do we lock down all these GitLab installations, make sure that we don't allow public sign up, the root password is checked. Like there's a lot of little technical pieces that need to be done, but that can kind of be done in the alongside like the let's now get this into the stable branch pipeline. Does that make sense to everyone? Like improving the like environments themselves is kind of a separate kind of effort to the, well, now we need to get them into the stable branches and deploying to them.
I think that makes sense. For the issues that you have here, Graham, that are showing us blocked on something, what are those things blocked on?
So they should only be blocked on other issues in this. So I'm actually curious what I did here to make this. I'm actually a bit curious myself. Why is this blocked? This should be. No, that shouldn't be blocked on that. I'm not sure why I thought that should be blocked on that. Because that's just getting the thing. Maybe I meant to do it the other way around. Maybe I
think you did unlink something else.
No, I think that's right. So this will block. We need to do this before we can deploy the releases. So I think we're okay. So that
is this not in progress?
Maybe it's not in. No, this is hang on. I should have probably. Maybe I haven't been as diligent enough with my bookkeeping. This should be in progress if it's not. Yeah, it's in progress. So this is kind of wrapping up and getting something working. So now if I refresh this, let's walk through the kind of block a tree and make sure it makes sense. Okay, so this is what we're currently kind of doing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We can't deploy stable branch environments until I finish getting it working. This is like can test suites. I think this either needs to be closed and recreated or renamed to like, we need to actually get QA working. This was, can we get test suites working? We know we can. Now we need an issue to actually get them working.
Okay, let's close that then, if that's the kind of answer. But yeah, we should make sure we have the issues. And actually what we found on the maintenance policy is if we have things that we are going to have to depend on quality for, let's get those created as soon as possible, because then we can hopefully get some time planned in for Q1, because they are very, very time constrained right now. So
yeah, this is actually like the release tools work was blocked by the CNG stuff, but it sounds like I can probably, I'm not sure if it's really blocked by CNG. I mean, it's blocked in the sense that we can't have release tools actually trying to deploy environments if the images aren't ready. But I'm not sure if that was. That's
fine. I think that's yeah.
So I think overall now there shouldn't be too many blockers. It's really, and I'll redo this issue for the QA test suites. That's the other part, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong. No, actually, I do know this. I'm pretty sure we want to do the QA running inside the stable branch, in the pipeline in the GitLab or GitLab repo. So we're going to have the downstream pipeline to distribution, the interface downstream pipeline or what have you to release environments, and then the downstream trigger into QA. But it's in the branch that runs on the stable pipeline. So that way, when you merge in GitLab or GitLab, you merge in that, you get a pipeline saying, this pipeline is now running on that. And if that goes red, and so that will give you the green or red to the developer if their merge, failed to deploy, failed QA, or some other thing. But I think the idea is the pipelines on the stable branch are kind of like our coordinated pipelines in auto deploy. That was my understanding, and I think me and Myra discussed this somewhere, probably in this. I think I think this is. Oh no, maybe it was somewhere. I think maybe it was in the actual issue for the policy maintenance extension.
I was going to say, I feel like some of these might be, I don't know if they overlap or whether they fit together, but probably there's a couple of pieces that Myra's moving forward on, particularly around the sort of interim testing plan, which at the moment where we're up to there is quality. So Sanad from quality is reviewing the sort of the interim proposals, but actually depending on what he suggests from that will probably feed in here, because the sort of interim ones are, do we use the package and test job? The problem if we do use that is it's quite flaky. So it's a sort of a, what do quality want to do about that flakiness, for example? So that probably does fit into this stuff.
Yeah. And I think the thing is, we can kind of, like, the great thing is, like, you can put 2 jobs, you can set jobs allow to fail. So we could run package and QA and also be like, okay, let's deploy to release environment. Like, especially as we're still kind of like getting the environment stable and kind of figuring the bugs out of them. We probably are going to have a lot of these jobs set to maybe not allow,
maybe initially to test that.
Initially, and then as we get more stable, we'll pick, maybe we'll drop one, or like maybe we'll drop the package in QA, or maybe we'll keep them both but allow one to fail, but this has to succeed, and we can always play around with that.
Yeah, there's also a limitation in package in QA that is related to component version. So every component that is in managed versioning will be tagged in that same release, but with the work you're doing in release environment, it will be highly possible to replicate the same behavior on the stable branches of components as well, so that whatever, let's say Rails is a component like any other one. So whatever components get a commit on a stable branch, it can self-update by his own SHA on release environment and trigger a full QA run on that environment. And then the end result is, if I want to tag a stable release of GitLab, I can check the stable branches of all the known supported components and say, are all those things green? If they are, then it's safe to tag. While package in QA only works on the Rails part.
Yeah. That's a very good point, actually. I didn't even think about that, but that's very perceptive. We should totally support. We'd be able to support that in the future. Anyone should be able to interface in and basically say, I've got a new version of my component, only like update the SHA, the version or whatever is of their component, and still kind of like, deploy to that environment, get some useful result out of that yes, things are still working.
Makes sense. For the due date on this epic, and actually, so Graham, I know you've added the at-risk label. Is that at risk of not hitting January 27th? Or okay, great.
So my kind of the way I structured that after the feedback from the video about how we want to do project management was, I set the due date to, like, when we defined was acceptable, and it was an OKR, so I was like end of the quarter, and then I was like, well, theoretically, looking at the amount of work, this is not going to be done by the end of the quarter, therefore at risk.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, should we reset that due date now, because we know we're not going to hit the 27th, but we also know we want to keep going on it.
Sure.
Do you have an idea at the moment of, knowing what you currently know, like what would be a sort of a realistic date that we might, like, it doesn't have to be locked in stone, but just as we are aiming at for now?
I think with if we're talking about the whole epic, so that includes all of making the release environments themselves, we need to make them kind of stable and secure and things like that.
Yeah.
And also combine with it sounds like we want to kind of scope this epic to be on the stable branches of maybe just the GitLab repository to start with, at least. Then I still think we're probably looking at 2 months. That's kind of being a bit pessimistic. I'd like to be more optimistic, and we may get there ahead of time, but just thinking about probably more of the complexity of the stable branch stuff than anything.
Okay, let me bump this to the end of March. Remove the at-risk label.
Sure.
And then when you do your status update, you can just kind of mention
clarify
we've reviewed that. And the other question, which I think we probably don't want to go ahead, was the based on your availability, Graham, and the fact that we only have you around and other things going on, there was the question of, like, do we want to pause this until we have more time? I think it probably sounds like no is the answer, but we're accepting that this will just take a little bit longer.
I think so at this stage.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, and that makes sense. What do we want to do about handling So, I mean, the sort of the challenge of bringing together this epic with the maintenance policy extension epic is, how do we want to handle all of the things that we don't have covered by these release environments? So, for example, a patch release may have all kinds of different bits and pieces in there. Well, we will need to get to a point as soon as we can where we can actually say maintenance policy is extended, and the release managers have a sort of like relatively straightforward time to be able to produce 3 patch releases. Do we need to put some sort of interim thing in place, or like what would be our plan for there's a Italy change that's going in 3 patches? How do we actually handle that?
So I guess there's 2 parts here. So the actual the release environments part, to the release environment stuff by design, is the release environments repo, and what it does is pretty simple. You just give it some versions of some containers to run, and it will put it in an environment for you. So that, once that's working, it's up to us to define, when we're going to stick files in with version numbers, what those version numbers are, and, running QA against them. So I may be misunderstanding the question, and apologies if I am. I think the bigger question then is like, so if we have this Italy fix and it goes back into 3 releases, like the process of the developer having to create the 3 backports, and is it how do we give confidence that the last, that fix hasn't broken anything in the last 3 releases? Is that what you're kind of looking for?
Well, I think
I'm trying to,
in terms of sort of being able to confidently say we can extend the maintenance policy, and that we are able to, we can support patch releases going back for the past 3 versions.
So it's really a case of, we want to be able to say, regardless of in release environments or something else, we want to be able to say we're confident that we have a way of testing that if a developer does a backport, that it will build and pass some level of testing, right? Like, I feel like that would be the overall confidence. We want to say yes, because at the moment we can't. I guess that's the big problem, right? Like, at the moment we can do the latest release because we've got like release.gitlab.net and stuff, but anything older than that, we've got nothing. So I guess realistically, what we want to say is, I'm not exactly up to date with what Mara is doing as this interim solution, I guess the packaging QA job, but it sounds like for Italy, the packaging QA job is actually useless, if what Alessio is saying is correct.
Not exactly. So
Okay.
I think the key point here is that even today, with a single patch release, we are not testing this thing that Amy is talking about. The only way we test it is by, after the package is produced, so it's already tagged, it's ready to load. Right. We are installing it on release. So if it doesn't work, then we created a broken release. And in the new world, we will know if we broke the current current milestone, say, but we will just infer that this eventually broke even the other one, but we will not be able to actually figure this out, because package NQA refers to the content of the branch, of the Rails branch itself. That being said, as an interim solution, which we need to validate, but I'm quite sure it will work, we can say that when you component developer merge something into the stable branch, you can even open you should open a merge request on the stable branch on the Rails that is bumping the version file.
The version,
because if you're bumping the version file with SHA, this will affect the package NQA. Package NQA in that case will read the content.
Yep.
It should read. I mean, I'm assuming it's reading because I don't know. So what I can tell for sure is that the unit testing in the project itself will download the correct version and will run the test on the SHA. That's I can say for sure. I'm also assuming that package NQA will actually refer to the content of those version file and build the packages accordingly. And so this will give us a package and QA that will also take care of, say, Gitly backports.
Cool. Okay.
And when we tag, everything will be overwritten, and we would just end up with the shiny names as expected. So this will be, it's a way that we can test something, but then in the end we will still overwrite everything and produce the expected package version.
So here's a question then. I'm sensitive to time, so hopefully I won't derail things too much just with me trying to learn and understand. But I thought the developers, so when they did a fix in their own stable branch, so let's say it's Gitly, right? So they've got their Gitly stable branch, they merge their fix on and what have you. I thought they always had to go into the GitLab org and bump the version file anyway.
No.
Or if do we do it for them as part of that like tagging process?
Yeah. As part of, so when they were doing the manual version, so let's say pages up until 2 months ago, they would have to figure out what was the version released in
go back
version
branch.
Go from that, pick the fix, then go back and bump the version. So it's all manual.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So I see the question a bit more completely now. Yeah, so okay, so that's fine, and I think that actually might segue, like the stipulation that you fix it in your stable branch, but then you also go into the GitLab org and bump the version file is not necessarily, like, it's a little bit more work for them. It's not necessarily bad for the interim solution. And I actually think it may not be bad as a starting point for the release environments. At the moment, the release environments could really just be deployed, like take what is in those version files and deploy that into the release environment. So it's not like as a first step, like ideally we want all the components themselves doing it, but that's a lot of work to kind of like go into all these different components, have this trigger part, like it becomes, the complexity is a little bit more in terms of permissions and things. What I'm saying is if we're like, okay, the interim step is packaging QA, but it does mean also developers have to make sure they bump the SHA on the branch preemptively. They can't just wait for the tag job. It is a bit annoying, but at least it sounds like it'll make the packaging QA job work. And at least it also means the first iteration of release environments, we can just take everything from the version files and just do one trigger into it and say, here's all of the new component versions we want to deploy, just do that. Then over time, once we're confident in that, we would actually be like, okay, so, you know, the Gitly project can just trigger the release environments deploy from their own repository, right? They no longer need to bump the version file. Like we can improve that over time and then offer that to other components and push it out. But I think at the moment, for simplicity, just keeping all of the changes coming through the version files and the GitLab org stable branch might be a simple way for us to like reduce the amount of complexity and actually get something going. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And it'll also work for both. Like it'll work for packaging QA and also this as a first iteration.
Yeah, I would also consider you mentioned it's a little annoyance. Not even that much, because if you think about what happens today, they have no control over it. So they just say picking two, and then eventually 1 month later, or whenever we decide to run something, it may break. And right now it's more that they are in control because they say, this is ready. Maintainers, can you merge this? Then it's merged, and then it's up to me. So we are giving them a real environment that they don't have today, right? So it's up to them saying, now that I fixed something, I want to see this live in the environment. So so it's kind of every step has a shorter loop, feedback loop, which is probably something that they gain out of it, and they maybe makes this more useful.
I think that's very important, right? Because there's nothing worse than them coming back to an MR from a month old and being like, oh no, it's broken, or it's a merge conflict. Now you got to, like, we should push that forward. Like if they're ready, they do the MR, bump the version, solve all the problems, see the pipelines green, and then you're right, you can walk away because we're confident now it's on there and it's confident the tests are green.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so there's probably a couple of pieces. So I'll make sure Myra watches this recording. She is currently working with quality to figure out like what we can actually do with this package and test job, and whether that's the way that quality want to actually handle this. But regardless, like if we make sure we include in that the developers will need to bump versions, and then that will trigger whatever the tests that quality want to trigger, and that will eventually land on our environments. Cool. Okay, that makes sense. Thanks a lot.
I think we just want to, coming back to the original question, I think we want to just have confidence we have something. And as I said, I think for a while, we'll probably have packaging QA and like release environments trigger probably living side by side in the same stage, like doing both kind of thing, right? Like just for extra coverage. We just need something around that space to say we've defined some testing structure from this, that we're confident that we're taking the components of the versions that, you know, people are expecting or have told us to test, and we've done some level of testing of that.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're confident there that, you know, therefore, if we were to chop a release, everything has been tested, and, you know, we wouldn't expect issues.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Okay, great. Are there any other discussion topics we should go through? No? Okay, great. So on our kind of collaboration check-in from our retro, are you personally getting enough collaboration to complete your tasks? So that can be from within our team or outside. Any concerns?
No concerns. I think no.
Cool.
It's been a tricky couple of months, obviously, because priority differences and holidays and everything else. So it's not been a normal quarter. We all expected that. So
yeah, that makes sense. Great. And is there anything else we can do to improve on collaboration? I'd say probably just the one, we talked about it already a little bit, but Graham, just to sort of have a little think in advance about, are there things that we can kind of see coming up that we may need other teams for? Because especially at this time of year, like if we could give them the heads up that, oh, distribution at some point in the next 3 months, we'll probably need some help for this, then, you know, we can hopefully get involved in people's OKR planning. So if there is any of that stuff we can tell people about, let's do that. Cool. Great. Anything else anyone wants to mention before we wrap up? No? Okay, awesome. Well, have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thanks for joining. Thanks for the discussions. It's